Hello to participants joining this. We're going to give it a couple of seconds for others to join, and then we'll get started. Welcome to those who are just joined. We're just waiting for others to keep joining the Zoom, and then we'll get started in a moment. All right, I think maybe we can get started while we wait for others also to keep joining our conversation today. Welcome everyone to the Africa launch event of the Digital News Report 2024. I'm Federica Cherubini. I'm Director of Leadership Development at the Reuters Institute, and I'll be your host for this conversation today. Today, we'll be discussing the findings of the most comprehensive study of news consumption around the world, the Digital News Report, which was published earlier this week, and what this means specifically for news media in Africa. This is a 13th edition of the report and is based on data from 6 continents and 47 markets, with the addition of this year of Morocco. And this makes it the largest report to date that we've published on the DNR. I'm joined by Nick Newman, lead author of the Digital News Report, Chris Roper, Deputy CEO of Code for Africa, Patricia Magopeni, Board Director at SABC in South Africa, Linus Kaikai, Group Editorial Director at the Royal Media Services in Kenya, and Himro Al-Kais, Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis. We will have a presentation by Nick, followed by a discussion with our experts. But first, let me start with giving the floor to Chris Roper from Code for Africa, who will help us get started and set the scene. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks, Federica, and hi, everybody. So as Code for Africa, we're proud to partner with Reuters on this report and on the 4 countries that are covered by this report, 4 African countries covered by the report. We're also proud to fund those country sections. And we're very glad that we could add Morocco to the report this year. Only covering 4 countries, however, does mean we're still missing a large number of other African countries from the report. And I hope that other funders will come forward to help address this. So this report plays a vital role in helping us to understand and to monitor media sustainability. And we need the data for as many countries as possible. That's perhaps even more important for African countries. In the last week or so, Media24 in South Africa has announced that it's closing up to 5 of its print titles and that up to 400 employees may lose their jobs. In Kenya, the Nation Group is laying off another 180 staff members after an earlier round of layoffs. And we're seeing similar things happening in Nigeria and in Morocco. The Reuters Digital News Report is an in-depth survey of how the people who consume news across the globe view our news industry. And perhaps more crucially, it's about how they use news for their own purposes. But for editors and journalists, it's also a set of tools for thinking about the health of the media in the countries in which we work. So I'm hoping we can draw some lessons from it and evolve strategies based on the data that Nick's about to share. And I hope we can evolve strategies that will help to make media more sustainable on our continent. News isn't a nice to have, despite what Twitter and Twitter/X would have us believe. It's an essential machine for maintaining and strengthening open societies, civil discourse, and democracies in Africa. And the Reuters Digital News Report is a very necessary part of the fuel that powers that engine. Let me hand over to Nick to present the data. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction. And I'm going to just talk you through some of the key findings and in particular some of the African data. You've already heard the scope of this report, and I am going to focus mainly on those 4 African countries. Just a word first about the methodology. So this is based on online polling, and that has a number of limitations. So it's based as far as possible on representative samples in each country. In some of the African countries, what we're really seeing here is a representative sample of people who are online. So it will tend to be slightly younger than national populations. And in countries like South Africa and Kenya, it's mainly the English-speaking market that we're looking at as well. So bear that in mind when we look at country differences. And I should also just say, apart from Code for Africa, we're supported by the Google News Initiative and by a range of broadcasters, foundations, academic institutions around the world. There's the 4 African countries set out there. So 2,000 samples in each country. So, I mean, I think one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing right now is what's going on with online platforms. And that's obviously partly linked to new technologies like AI, but it's also about changing audience behavior, and it's about the changing strategies of those social media companies. And the most obvious example of this is what's going on right now with Facebook, where we've seen a significant decline in weekly use for finding, sharing, consuming news. This is an aggregate data of around 12 countries we've been tracking since 2014, sorry. And this is part of a deliberate strategy to pull back from politics, to pull back from news, and invest more in content that it sees as being more engaging for its users, including from creators rather than, say, traditional publishers. And then if we layer on some of the other social and video networks, we can see this other big trend, which is the very sharp growth in video networks or visually led networks. So that is YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. And it's also worth pointing out that Facebook and X are also leaning into video and prioritizing formats designed to keep people within their platforms. So this sort of post and refer model that media has depended on for so many years is becoming diminished even before search traffic gets affected by AI, which many people expect. So this chart represents many Western countries, but actually we see these shifts moving, if anything, even faster in Africa. So this is the data for Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Morocco. You can see in most of those countries, in all of the countries, we've seen a decline in the use of Facebook. We've seen an even bigger decline in the use of Twitter in the last year. And then going the other way, so more growth in YouTube across all the countries, particularly Kenya. TikTok, again, very strong growth in Kenya, very strong growth in Nigeria, and strong growth in South Africa as well. We don't have obviously comparative data yet for Morocco, but as we go forwards, we'll pick that up as well. So just talking a little bit more about TikTok, and I think it's really interesting to see Africa in that global context. So overall, across all 47 countries we look at, 13% say they use TikTok for news. But if you look at those African countries, which I've picked out in the pink, you can see that the figure is much higher. So in Kenya, it's 3 times as high. You know, over a third now saying they're using TikTok for news. That's not just young people. That's our entire sample, and high in all the other Africa countries as well. And of course, TikTok has become much more influential with politicians, with politics. It's been used in elections for spreading information and for spreading disinformation. Compare that with, say, the UK or US, where TikTok is growing, particularly with younger people, but the numbers are much smaller. If we look at YouTube, we see a very similar picture. So again, a lot of the highest usage of YouTube is in Africa and other countries in the global south. So the average using for news is 31% across all countries. In Kenya, it's 59%, so double it. And in Morocco as well, very strong use of YouTube for news. So these video networks are becoming a much more important part of the ecosystem. So a lot of change going on in social and video networks, but does it matter? How much does it matter? Why does it matter? and how important are different platforms. So this is a question we ask about gateways to news. So how do you find the news? Where do you start your news journey? And what you see, I'm just using Kenya as an example, but most of the African countries are very similar. You see the majority of people saying they prefer to start their news journey with a social network or video network, and only 16% say that they prefer to go to a news website or app as their preference. There's also search and mobile alerts and all the rest of it. And just to compare that with a European country, a Northern European country like Finland, you can see that 63% prefer to go directly to a news website or app. So this direct connection that some publishers in countries like Finland have is much, much harder in Kenya, in South Africa, in Morocco, and Nigeria. And that obviously makes it much harder to build those direct connections, to charge for news. A whole load of other consequences flow from that. And just to set out the data for all 4 countries. So if you look at the middle row is the percentage who say they prefer to access via social media. You can see how search or other aggregators are also important. And in Morocco actually has the least connection with those direct routes to market out of all the countries. And South Africa has the most. Traditionally has very strong brands, with some of them having strong direct connections. Related to this, and I've talked about it already, is the rise of video. And we've really seen this taking off as data charges come down and formats get more compelling across short form and long form video. So across all of the markets now, we have some really high figures. So short form video, 66%. So 2/3 say they have access to short form video in the last week. And in countries like Kenya and Nigeria, the figure is more like 90% of our sample, which is an urban online sample. But it's a very significant part of people's media diets. Also in the US, we're seeing a lot of long form, short form video, really significant growth. Whereas in some other Northern European markets, it's a lot less. So it's around, I think it's around 1/3 in the UK, for example. So much, much higher again in some of the markets we're talking about. And then this is just reinforcing that point about the importance of YouTube. It is different in different markets. So if you look on the left-hand side, this is a question we ask about: what is your main video platform? In the Philippines, it's actually Facebook. In India, it's YouTube. In South Africa, it's a kind of combination of YouTube and Facebook. So Facebook remains, important, and that's quite typical across most of the African markets. But in some of those Northern European markets, a lot of the consumption of video is on those direct platforms, on the websites and apps of media companies. So that's kind of what we're hoping we might get to, but at the moment it's still very much dominated by the social media. Why are people consuming so much short form and medium form video now? So part of it is trust. People feel that they can trust what they see if it's a video, that it doesn't come with agendas or spin of traditional media companies, for example. There's the convenience, so it's just really easy to consume, it's short, and that it's personalized. It really fits your personal interest. The algorithm is sending you content that is always interesting. And then finally, just the range of content that is out there. So there's hard news, there's soft news, there's lifestyle, there's how-to videos. There is literally everything within one platform. So this combination, I think, is really powerful. And here's just a couple of comments from South Africa about why people say they use video. I don't have time to watch TV. I've always got my mobile phone with me. Anytime I'm at work, I can just open YouTube and watch news whenever I want it. So it's that convenience again. And other people are just scrolling through their feeds, and then they see a bit of news about crime in this particular case, and they stop and watch it. So it's this sort of incidental exposure, as opposed to, I know I want news and I'm going to go to a news website. Of course, this year we're seeing a huge number of elections around the world, and including in many African countries. And this comes at a time of rising concern about misinformation of various kinds, including AI-generated fakes and the potential impact on our democracies. Overall, in our data, again, this is across all 47 countries, we find that about 6 in 10, so 59%, say they are worried about whether they can tell the difference between what is true and what is false on the internet when it comes to news. And that figure is higher in Africa. So we see this every year, but 75%, so much higher levels of concern, probably because of that higher use of social media. And then also we find that some of the biggest increases this year have been in countries where they are holding or have held elections, such as the United States, South Africa, and India. And this comes as online platforms are becoming increasingly affected by artificial intelligence videos, synthetic media, imagery that is becoming much more photorealistic. So these are fake images from the war in Gaza, for example, which now look completely photorealistic. And many of the people we talk to for the qualitative part of our work this year, we're really worried about their ability to tell what was true going forwards. This idea of seeing is believing. You used to believe what you saw, you used to believe the pictures, even if you didn't believe the words, you believed the pictures. That seems to be breaking down, and I think this is a real cause for concern amongst many people. For the first time this year, we've asked about trust in specific platforms and the extent to which people say they find it easy or difficult to identify true and untrue information in each platform. And consistently across countries, we find that it is TikTok at the top and X, which are the networks that people are most worried about. In some countries in the global south, that concern is even higher. So here's Kenya, for example. So the average for TikTok is 27%, 35% in Kenya. And TikTok has been the subject of motions in the Kenyan parliament. It's been labeled a threat to cultural and religious values. And it's obviously been implicated in sharing of political misinformation, adult content, hate speech, a whole range of other things. Apart from the sort of concern about misinformation, we've also looked at emerging attitudes to AI in the news and the way in which news publishers are now starting to adopt artificial intelligence in their work and integrating it into workflows and into their products. And in the survey, we asked people about two different scenarios, how comfortable they were with two different scenarios. So firstly, where AI is actually creating content. So this might be rewriting copy, and maybe there's some human checks on it, but it's a bot that's writing the copy. Or it may be that the AI is answering a question you may have about the news. And broadly, what you can see here is people are more uncomfortable than comfortable with this. They're not comfortable with it, basically, particularly in the UK and US. In South Africa, for some reason, maybe the South African members of the panel can explain why this might be. People seem to be a little bit more comfortable with AI writing their news for them. But then the second scenario is where basically the humans are in charge and AI is playing a supportive role. And in this case, you can see it's reversed. So the vast majority of people are, or people are more comfortable than uncomfortable with this scenario. Though it's fair to say that there are still a lot of emerging attitudes. A lot of people are not clear what these use cases are yet. This is still very, very early days. I guess one of the good news parts of the report for Africa is that trust in the news remains stable. And across our survey, we find 4 in 10 say they trust most news most of the time. That's the average. And I'm just going to show you the scores for African countries. And one of the things that's interesting, and again, maybe we can discuss this in the panel, is that trust levels in Africa and in African news brands generally are much higher than the global average, and they've been increasing, which is a surprise in many ways because of some of these other concerns that we've talked about in terms of misinformation. But if you look at Kenya, for example, it's gone up almost 15 points. It's the second most, trust is number 2 out of all 47 markets. And individual media brands are also still highly trusted. So even if people aren't going directly, there is still a sense of independence of Kenyan media, which we know is one of the key factors. South Africa, again, there's been a lot of cases of false information, in many cases purveyed by media companies themselves, and politically motivated attacks on the media as well. But that doesn't seem to have reduced the trust scores either. They've been going up. In Nigeria, trust has also been going up. And again, independent media companies have high ratings for the brands. And I suppose the exception is Morocco. So in Morocco, it's much lower. So it's not the lowest, but it's lower than the other countries here. So only 31% say they trust most news most of the time. And as we set out in the country report, much of this is to do with perceptions of lack of independence by or self-censorship, avoiding a lot of sensitive subjects, which I think is probably something that also happens in other African countries. We can discuss that later. When we look at the most important factors in defining whether a media outlet is trustworthy or not, and again, I'm just using Kenya as an example, but other countries are pretty similar. It's pretty clear what public wants. Public expects the media to be transparent and open. They expect it to have high standards of accuracy and ethics. They expect it to represent people fairly, and they don't want it to be biased or to have specific agendas. So, I mean, it's quite straightforward in many ways, and if trust is low, it's broadly because people feel the media is not fulfilling some of these core expectations that audiences have of the media. So just finally, before we get into the discussion, just a couple of quick headlines. So every year, we obviously, and Chris talked about this at the beginning, the sustainability of the media, the business models are critical. And we are seeing more attempts to charge directly for news through subscription or membership or donation models. But it's much harder in Africa because of the lack of those direct connections. We don't actually track it in Africa either because it's difficult to ask about. But in many other countries, 20 countries here, you can see that over the last few years, more people are prepared to pay for news, but it's still a minority in every country. So 4 in 10 say they are paying a subscription of some kind or membership in Norway, just 8% in the UK. So there's quite a lot of variation across countries. And much of that depends on the amount of free news that is available and people's willingness and ability to pay, of course. But what we've seen is subscription levels have really leveled out as the cost of living crisis has really started to hit in many, many countries. And there's a lot of discounting going on. The other headline that I wanted to share was around, I think we talked about this last year, was around the extent to which people feel that they want to avoid the news because it's overly difficult or negative. And obviously much of this is to do with the news agenda. We've been through, pandemic, we've been through, there's wars raging around the world, there's economic gloom, and people quite often feel that they want to avoid the news sometimes or often. So across all countries, about 39% say that they sometimes or often avoid the news. This comment from South Africa, most of the news I consume is not favorable. I start to feel sad and depressed. And here are just a couple of other comments from South Africa around this issue of news avoidance or news fatigue. So negativity, crime, it makes me angry, it makes me feel negative. So there's something about our product which is making people feel sad and depressed, which is about pointing out problems all the time and not offering solutions, which is another sort of theme of the report, that people say they want more from the media. It's something that gives them hope. And this is, I just put this in because I met the owner of the Good Things Guy podcast this week in South Africa, and he's created a little media company which is based on giving more constructive or more positive news stories and to frame difficult subjects, to deal with difficult subjects, but to do it in a more constructive way, and is having some success. So it'll be interesting to hear what the panel thinks about the overly negative agenda, because we have to do that as journalists. We have to cover these difficult stories, but at the same time not to leave people sad and depressed. So just 5 things, I think, to sort of help set the tone for the discussion. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty in that platform environment, and big questions about how African media companies will survive if they don't get regular traffic from those social media platforms, given the dependence on social media, how to build more direct connections over time and reduce that platform dependence. Secondly, there is this sort of growth of video, which in many ways is an opportunity, but also potentially difficult because you are competing with not just with other media companies, you're competing with influencers, you're competing with a whole range of different kinds of information. There's the questions around artificial intelligence. Audiences are skeptical. They have a strong sense that they want humans to be in control. And how can publishers incorporate some of those efficiencies that may be possible from AI, but without losing trust, which is obviously critical. Misinformation and trust, so African audiences are particularly worried about this. Is that an opportunity to rebuild those direct connections and to show that media houses have that trust, and in many cases do still have that trust with the vast majority of people? And then what can we do about news avoidance and news fatigue? Should we be continually bombarding people with very difficult news, or are there other ways in which we can think about changing the mix, or changing the format, or changing the ways in which we tell stories? So just some thoughts, and all of the data, of course, is on our website. We have an interactive feature where you can explore different parts of the data. And the full report is downloadable there as well. But I will stop sharing my screen and very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nick, for this overview. We'll now have a conversation with our experts, and you can see on Zoom there is a Q&A option. So if you and the audience have any question, just post your question there, and I'll try to get as many as possible. So starting maybe from what is one of the big headlines from the report that Nick started from, so this platform reset, and how specifically we're seeing a reliance on what was the link economy and the ability of bringing people back from social media platform to our website really becoming more fragile. So I wanted to do a round with our experts here. What does it mean from your perspective? How do we rebuild, and how do we build these direct connections in an environment that is so fragmented? Patricia, can I ask you to start?
Okay, good afternoon to people who are watching online, and you had to start with me on that question. What I've seen happening with the over-reliance on social media platforms is that, one, it distorts editorial strategies, because you look at what people are consuming and think that that's what they actually want to consume. And yet we forget that the algorithms that these platforms use actually direct and channel audiences to what they prefer the audiences to consume. But what we have started looking at is OTT platforms, which are providing that direct link to audiences. I know the public broadcaster is actually already running an SABC Plus platform, which is an OTT where audiences can actually go directly and watch whatever they want to watch that's coming from the public broadcaster, from entertainment to news content. And I think this is one way of having control over the audience consumptions and audiences. And it's also a way to try and monetize these audiences without having to rely on third-party platforms like big tech. So this is the direction that most media houses are considering. And I know also with Bhekisisa, where I am on a daily basis, it's also a consideration that we're making, that it's actually unsafe to think that we can build big estates that are profitable on a land that we don't own. It's not our platforms. And if you look at the way these platforms are starting to deprioritize content, they may pull the plug tomorrow. And what happens to our over-reliance on these platforms? So the idea that we should have direct link with our audiences and have these OTT platforms is actually what is being considered now.
Thank you so much. Hemru, can I bring you in? I saw you nodding while Patricia was talking. How are Moroccan media companies thinking about this challenge of audiences being in platforms that we don't control, as she was saying?
Good. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank, Reuters and Oxford for this study. This was definitely needed, and I'm so honored to be speaking on behalf of Morocco, or at least trying to elucidate what's happening. I do think that the Moroccan media platforms actually see, or have been seeing, these social media platforms as a amplifier for their news outlets. If anything, these social media platforms, or before they existed, news consumption was on the decline, if anything, and then social media actually gave them a boost. So it was not seen as a threat by any chance. But then I do join my colleague Patishwa, I hope I'm saying that right, in the sense that, yes, they are catering, we know what we call clickbaiting and everything, and this has been prominent, and it has specifically been, I would say, the trust, let's say, levels have been built during the COVID era, or if I can call that era, we're still kind of living that, but in the sense that many of the official, information that's been shared and everything, you realize which of the media outlets were actually sharing the proper data 2-3 days, or the proper news, I would say, 2-3 days down the road. So that's when kind of the public said, okay, well, I can trust this media platform versus this other. I do think that what's happening in Morocco is that, first of all, there is a need for investigative journalism. Obviously, we haven't properly surveyed that, but in the sense that there is actually a willingness to pay for it. I mean, when you think about Morocco willingness to pay for news being higher than the UK, I mean, even though slightly, that there's something interesting there. The point is, even though there's self-censorship, even though there's limits, actually people do look forward to paying for subscription, at least to some extent, especially the elite, especially the well-educated, because they're looking for an outlet where they can read and trust it. For example, if you consider one of the outlets that we that have been surveyed, but it was really down the list of usage, which is Le Desk. Actually, most Le Desk users do pay for it. So if you know how to target your niche market, I think you do have a sustainable business model. And at the end, I do think that most Moroccans are not willing to pay because they see the prices too high. There's, it's a Maslow theory of, hierarchy of needs. Like news consumption is pretty low in terms of what they would like. They do see it as important, but maybe lower the prices would actually work for Morocco. That is my take on that.
Thank you so much. Linus, in Kenya, this fragmentation and prominence of platform like TikTok is particularly also felt. How is your organization thinking about this? Is this an opportunity to cultivate audiences where they are, or is a danger of building on a land that we don't own?
Well, thank you, Federica, and thank you, team. Very insightful report, Nick. Thank you so much for that. What we are witnessing actually is the increased power of the consumer. The bargaining power of the consumer has really gone up because of the social media, and the numbers tell it. Though they are consuming a lot of our content, you would see in the report that the bulk of that is through the indirect route, which is the social media, as opposed to the direct one. The reason for that is increasingly the consumer wants their voices heard directly and edited. So the long old days of letters to the editor, then you find a small space to fit that, gone completely. Because what these consumers are saying is, yes, I've watched your story, but go to my timeline to listen to what I think about what your story is all about. So it's a power play in a way. And what we've done in the Kenyan media setup to survive this is also to play big in the social media space. We are strong on YouTube. You have to be strong on YouTube as a brand. You have to be strong on TikTok as a brand, because that's where the consumers are. And even while there, you also have to meet them midway in terms of how they want to consume the information. So are you also creating content that is interactive, that allows them to have their say? There's just the biggest story today in Kenya, and it's live on our television right now. It's driven by social media. It's around a hashtag. It's Reject Finance Bill 2024. It's about the budget that the government is just presented the other day. And there are massive protests led by the young people. They're called the Gen Z, and it's openly been stated as much that this is the Gen Z protest, and that's what's going on right now. So there is the direct coverage, but I'm just looking at our numbers on YouTube. They're equally very, very high. But what do they go for in there is the comment sections, because they are giving directions there. Oh, let's meet at point B. Let's meet in that street. The police have blocked that route. Don't go to that route. They are communicating, and it is a relationship of almost equals. And so we see this as a really empowered consumer coming into the space, and a media that must innovate to and contribute to that social space where the consumer is empowered and the content is consumed. My final point, and just the point that my colleague from Morocco was making, and which is the question of then commercializing that content. It is an ongoing dilemma, and I call it a dilemma because we haven't seen around our Kenyan media space a successful model in terms of commercializing content that is heavily social media. So as much as our highest views are in the social media, much of our money comes from direct. So what you have to do is to also extend the value for your advertiser all the way to the social media space. And this, well, there's a word for it, innovation. Thank you. Thank you, Federica.
Thank you so much. Chris, I saw you briefly answering in the Q&A chat, but there was a question from someone saying, from a South African perspective, does this fragmentation in the audience offer an opportunity for regional commercial media? And you said you suspect it's a global opportunity. Tell us more. How is this a global opportunity?
Well, I think one of the answers to your question about the reset of the platforms is that news itself is undergoing a process of recalibration and reset, I suppose, and almost in a lot of cases starting from fresh. It's like you're beginning a new industry called news. So I think that, and I think the last couple of years of Reuters news reports have pointed to the fact that niching your content and niching your audience is going to be one way of being able to have a sustainable business model. It does mean it's a business model which doesn't bear a lot of relation to like the big behemoths of the past, but it is a business model which allows you to do the work of journalism, and I think that's going to be something that's common to a lot of the countries that the news report looks at.
Thank you. Patricia, we talk about video and video-led platforms becoming more and more important. From what you've seen, from of course being a broadcasters and of course being used to produce video, is there a recalibration there need to be done to convert some of these medium and the video in something that suits this platform? Is it an advantage if you have sort of like a traditional understanding of video, or is it fundamentally different?
Correct. Just before I respond to that question, the question that was raised on the chat that Chris has also responded to, I think it's not only an opportunity, a regional opportunity, as Chris says, that it's a global opportunity, but not only for commercial, but also public broadcasters and in fact, public platforms, public media, to actually look beyond their domestic audiences. But what that's going to require is investment, because if you talk relevance, it means that you're going to have to be able to provide content that's relevant to those audiences in those countries. It can't just be the South African story that you are going to export. It means that you also need more investment that's going to cater to those audiences. So there is that aspect, but it is an opportunity. On the question of video, it is an opportunity that we still need to explore, because currently we rely on mainly YouTube and to some extent Facebook, and that Facebook, I mean YouTube is also incidental viewing, because what we do there is to provide live streaming in the main. So the consumption of news on YouTube is driven by live streaming and also post publishing or post broadcast content that goes to YouTube, that would have gone through the first platform before it goes to YouTube. We're not seeing customized content that goes directly to YouTube without going via other platforms that would have published it first. So I do think that there's an opportunity if we are going to have comprehensive news consumption, social media. We need to customize the content that's going to go there. But also the fact that you have Facebook that's still providing that opportunity, but bearing the threats to deprioritize content on Facebook has its own implications. But I do think that focusing on what is still available and that's giving us space to do that, being YouTube, we need to start customizing content that goes to YouTube, similarly to the way we do with TikTok and Instagram.
Thank you. Chris, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, something Patiswa just said about what's going to be necessary is resources to enable niche, regional, or localized news brands to flourish. One of the things about the Digital News Report is that it talks about the amazing potential of generative AI to help as a resource for news production. And I think Gen AI is going to be one of the pillars of small, niched, new, sleek news organizations. I think it's something that people are paying a lot of attention to. And I think somebody asked earlier a question about why South Africans are less scared of AI-produced news. I think it's because a lot of our news producers have done a really good job of demystifying AI for news readers, and specifically digital news readers. So I think that might even have been something that was in the last Digital News Report about AI, which said that part of the problem is that it needs to be demystified, and that a lot of journalists are talking about something that they don't even know what they're talking about. I think in South Africa we've done a slightly better job than a lot of other places in making the robots more friendly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Hemre.
Yes, I'd like to just just say a few things about the YouTube specifically, at least within Morocco. So first of all, YouTube videos obviously are a huge part of the, let's say, I wouldn't really put them in the news category. I would put them in entertainment news category specifically. So what you have is a bunch of YouTubers kind of looking at what's going on and giving political commentary or giving sort of a funny take on things, actually me included. So the thing is that I wouldn't really put this as a direct competition. But what I'm not seeing, perhaps even other countries, you perhaps could tell me, is that we're not seeing a merging of a traditional media and YouTube in general. So for example, I don't see newsrooms actually, or any kind of TV programs inputting certain YouTube videos that have a certain degree of quality, which some YouTubers have very good educational content about specific topics. And I do think that the issue here has to do with contracting and how a traditional media would be able to, bring in a YouTuber, which is kind of seen an outside scope or perhaps seen as unworthy of the news media. So I do think that across the world, that's something that we have to think about, how we can merge these two, because obviously Gen Z, millennials, we're interested in this kind of content, entertainment news, analysis. It sort of gives a sense of trust and independence in some way. But at the same time, the traditional media is kind of stuck on its ways. It doesn't want to actually bring in these people and have them do shows or, put up their video clips and whatnot. I do think that certain YouTubers have reached the level to become traditional media. And I do think that they should be given a chance at that point. So this is what we're not seeing. And that's why I think we're seeing kind of an extreme sort of shift towards these video platforms. I mean, I don't know of many news outlets that do reels, to talk about a topic, yet you have influencers doing it. So I do think they need to borrow from each other. That's kind of the point I wanted to make.
And of course, it's very relevant because we've seen that actually some of the social media platforms are sort of shifting their focus away from traditional news and more towards influencers and individual creators and having partnerships and having more deals with them. Linus, from your perspective, of course, you have a lot of TV channels also amongst the publications, and of course there is a lot, that is the video component we were talking about before. How are you thinking about this shift towards creators, influencers, personalities? How do they carry from traditional TV to other channels? As Himra is saying, is an opportunity there, or is it still of a scary space? I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, Federica. Yeah, I was saying that we are guided by the trends. And one of the things that I can say that the Kenyan media has invested heavily in is just surveys, find out what is the consumer saying, find out what are their new preferences, find out what are they talking about. And just from Nick's presentation, the bit about the professional standards being the first thing. Now, what has happened is the consumer is still looking at mainstream media as the space where those standards apply, where there is an editorial process, whole process that checks for the credibility of that story, whether it's true, whether it's AI generated, whether it's accurate. And those basic old tenets of journalism are still informing the consumption of content, which is why the growth of the video space and especially the social media space is still, in the end, there's still a dotted line. The most successful videos will then have to pass the test, especially if it's news related. Now, what we've also seen is a distinction of what should go into news and current affairs, which then the bulk of duties in terms of verifying goes to the mainstream media and traditional editorial practices. And then there is the social side of things, where the influencers are increasingly really controlling. And the control, especially commercial advertising, product endorsements. And remember, these are things that are not supposed to be touched by traditional journalists. And in Kenya, we still have media restraining itself that you can't go that way. I know there's money in that product endorsement space, but don't do it because it might affect the credibility of your news or how your news presenters are perceived, for example. So the totality of the picture is there's a transition going on, but with a very, very strong hold to traditional values as the compass for news and current affairs.
I wanted to follow up. Nick, sorry, go and then I have a follow-up for Linus.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. But I think what Linus has just been saying really sort of talks about the dilemma that we're going to see over the next few years. So people still want, reliable news when they want it, and they want that verified, but they're not prepared to spend much time with those media companies. So how does it get paid is the fundamental issue. How do you get a sustainable media environment where that rather boring process of doing journalism and checking things, or going out and actually reporting on a story live, those things that the influencers aren't going to do, and the commercial rewards are all in the sort of product endorsement at the sort of softer end of things. And so what does that mean for our society? If those things can't be funded, then what happens to trust overall over time? And I think that's the big concern.
I was actually gonna to follow up to Linus on the point about trust and platforms. So TikTok is incredibly used in Kenya, levels much higher for news that we've seen in many other countries around the world. Yet the low levels of trust, and I know specifically in TikTok and with TikTok, there was a petition to Parliament recently to call for a ban. What's happening in that space?
I think we could call it that is the boiling pot of content of all manner, including news and current affairs. Entertainment, influencers, this is the space they go to. And the one thing that we realize is constant about that space is that is the space that is recruiting the highest number of the youth. Every young person that is just coming to consume content, their first point of the first platform is TikTok. And so the numbers are there. And so what this has triggered is a scramble for those numbers, including from us in the mainstream media, and saying, how do we reach out to that crowd of young people that is coming in through TikTok. But it's such a dilemma, and it's going to be for a while, because their stories that don't really fit that style of TikTok, which is more of entertainment. There's something we try to do here at Royal Media Services. We are very big on Citizen Digital, and we have a TikTok account. And the other day we started, just because of the demonstrations that are going on involving the young. So we tried to break down the finance bill, what it contains, and you have to do it in small pieces, not the bulky stuff that goes into the analytical desks of journalistic beasts. This has to be produced in very small bits, and they have to be really short, as things in TikTok are anyway very short.
Remaining on the topic of trust, and not just across platform, but also like trust towards media and traditional media. Patricia, we see in South Africa, or generally across the 4 African countries, higher level of trust compared to other countries, with the exception of Morocco and Himra. I'll get to you about that. At the same time, it's also true that high numbers of survey participants are concerned about misinformation and sorting out what's fake and what's real online. Is there a correlation there, Patricia? Is there like this higher level of trust that media enjoys in countries like South Africa? Can that help with making sure that audiences have better equipped to understand what's true and what's false online?
Yes, there is an opportunity there. I mean, I'm looking at the fact that the consent is sitting at 81% of the people surveyed. And I do think that is an opportunity, because it means that they have an understanding of the existence of information disorders in the first place. So what I do think needs to happen is raise the levels of social media literacy to the extent that people are more discerning of the content that they consume on social media. I mean, we have Media Monitoring Africa that has been driving campaigns to that effect, and particularly around election cycles, which actually helps for audiences to be able to identify what's true and what's fake. So it's a good thing that has happened in that space. But on the other hand, with the trust levels, if you look at the South African media in general, I do think that what has actually helped that we are not necessarily paying attention to is the monitoring and regulation that's happening in that space. South African media is actually heavily regulated than we care to talk about, because you have all these institutions, both statutory and self-regulation, that are actually monitoring how the media does its work. And in fact, as part of that process, the media has its own channels where it can actually report unfair coverage and misrepresentation in the media. So they have their own avenues as the audiences to go and report such. So basically, you have a media environment that has its own checks and balances, and that holds its peers to account whenever there are such instances through the editors forum. So there are many mechanisms that actually ensure that we have an environment that takes responsibility for the work that it does, and that there's due diligence in the way we conduct ourselves as journalists. I think that has actually helped how the trust levels have remained sort of stable and improving. And also, despite the fact that we have a sort of threatening political environment, I've been exposed to that. And I don't necessarily see it as a major threat at this point, more than what is happening with the capacity of newsrooms to actually do their work, because that is coming up as a serious threat. You have newsrooms that can't do what they are supposed to do, and do it in like producing a story that reflects rigor, and that has the completeness that's required, and that's free of bias. But you need resources to do that in any newsroom. So that is coming up as a threat because it's not only the political environment, it's now the commercial environment, because we are now starting to see newsrooms compromising on independence in terms of how the commercial influences are creeping in the newsroom in favor of getting content or generating content that provides revenues. That is becoming a new threat.
Thank you. Chris, you want to comment on this? You're on mute.
Emma. I would argue that if you have 81% of your news consumers worried about being able to tell what is real and isn't real online, and if almost 60% of them trust news brands, then they really, really are a very media literate society already. And that any more work in media literacy is just money being thrown away, actually. I mean, how much better can you get than that? Like, that is the ideal position for any news consumer to be in.
Thank you. I know we are approaching towards the end of this discussion, and there are many topics that we haven't touched or we briefly touch upon. One of the trends that Nick highlighted is still high level of people who avoid the news. Those who maybe follow normally the news, but decide to selectively avoid the news in some moments. And there was a question in the chat about traditional media specialized in doom and gloom and challenging conversations. And indeed, the world is a challenging place, and there is a lot of doom and gloom around us. Is a constructive approach there an option? Hemero, what are you saying from Moroccan media? How are they thinking about through this issue of reconnection, disconnect with some audiences turning away at some time? Does a more positive approach help?
Thank you for this question. I would like to perhaps kind of tackle a few things since we're at the end. Before I answer your question, it was not going to take long. I just want to explain to the viewers why trust in news in general is low in Morocco, just very briefly. And I wrote down a few things here. So first of all, the readership time spent on reading on average through the official statistics in Morocco is 2 minutes per day, which means we have a very, very, very low readership. We don't spend time reading on average throughout the population. Secondly, there has been a securitization of the state, if so to speak. So therefore, this has led to the securitization of media, which means a lot of the media outlets have become sort of an official outlet for the intelligence services in some way, actually, because and even that is not like, and that's why it's just distrusted. Another thing, it has to do with journalism education. Actually, our educational schools for journalism are not that great, and they don't teach investigative journalism. Another reason, and perhaps lastly, which actually obviously increases even within schools, we don't teach media literacy, which Patishwa actually spoke about. And lastly, I would say it has to do with, I mean, this is kind of an in the background reason, but none of the major news outlets in Morocco have actually open bids or open positions for editor-in-chief positions. So actually all editor-in-chief's positions are sort of picked based on political preference, and I don't know, I guess you could call it nepotist. So and this has been a real issue. I've discussed this with a few journalists. They're like, well, I can't apply for this job, so I have to just write the way they would like me to write, or have this specific editorial line to be taken. So these are roughly the reasons why trust is so low in Morocco. As for good news, I actually only know of one outlet that does this. It's called Infomédiaire. Obviously, very, very small sort of outlet, and they have this specific editorial line, and I actually enjoy reading them. Are they thinking about it? I cannot speak on that, honestly, but yes, there's a lot of, well, we call the, whatever, sex, drugs, crime, the Colombian School of Journalism, right? So the Colombian School of Journalism tends to sell and tends to have clickbait. So if that's the model, because it's social media dopamine based and everything, that is what people will tend to be writing about, there is this, like I said, it joins the idea of securitization, because we kind of focus on these stories, but we kind of focus on it with the angle of, oh, the police has caught such and such person. That's the positive news in Morocco, or the police is actually clamping down on such politicians. So this is the actual news feed right now that is sort of seen as positive, but if anything, is actually pushing for this idea that, you know, the state is clamping down, the state is doing its job. So that is how the media is actually currently thinking about positive news. And sorry for the long intervention. I just
thank you so much for clarifying the context around trust and low levels. Patricia, news avoidance. Do we need to rethink the product that we are offering to our audiences?
Maybe yes. For me, it's more about looking at news avoidance in terms of the different contexts where we operate, because what is causing news avoidance in Kenya may not be what is causing news avoidance in South Africa. So I do think that the underlying problems need to be identified in terms of the context where we are located. But I do think that one of the things that we may have to do, I had you at some point referring to being constructive in the way we tell our stories. And I do think that it's an approach that could work. I know there have been different views about what is labeled constructive journalism and different views about solutions journalism. But what could help maybe is to, while we are telling these stories that are viewed as causing fatigue, the crime stories and all other stories that are not seen to be helping the mood of the audiences, I do think that if we take the approach that there's a problem here, you identify the problem, but you don't end with the problem, and look at solutions that would have worked elsewhere and integrate those in your story. It may not be South Africa, it could be a different country, but I do think that we need to tell complete stories than just identifying problems. I suppose that the fatigue of the audiences is coming from the fact that we just dump the doom and gloom on them without pointing to directions that provide solutions.
Yeah, and maybe help them feel more powerful and actions to be taken. Linus, the same question for you in relation to high level of news avoidance and a bit of disconnect. Is the product that we are putting out for audiences need to be rethought in this sense?
I think I'll first start by agreeing with Patricia in terms of it is then what scenario, that is news, and then what. But the other question on whether we
I think you're breaking up a bit. I'm just going to give it a second to see if you come back. Patricia, if you want to go first while we see if Linus' connection you're back, Linus. Sorry, you cut up for a moment because your connection froze, but you're back. Sorry.
Okay. And I was saying the question is around the definition of news, because if we keep thinking that you can actually curate news to what the audience likes, then that won't be news. We'll now be talking of programs. We'll be talking of related coverage, not news. News is what happens, and what happens. Basically, you have absolutely no determination of what happens, whether it's a road accident, an air crash, war is happening, political news happens. Some of it very irritating and contributing to what you are calling their news avoidance. Because in Kenya, what actually drives news avoidance is heavily politics, especially the bad aftertaste of divisive elections. And you find people saying, I have not watched news since the election, maybe because it didn't go your way and you don't want to see this guy and his government talking, or the other way around. And that contributes to news avoidance. But in Kenya, there are two factors that really contribute to the question of trust. And let me call it mistrust. The first is political reasons, and the other one is commercial reasons. For political reasons, media houses and media outlets get punished heavily, depending on how they are perceived in their political coverage. If you are seen as politically biased towards one side over the other, you can be avoided by readers and TV viewers. And the numbers show, you can see the departures, you can see the arrivals. And then the second one is commercial, where increasingly audiences are asking whether, oh, you're doing that because you need to be paid for that. And it's very interesting that the same audience also doesn't like it when the news or current affairs is paid for, because they think then if it's paid for, then it's not independent. So those two also do contribute to news avoidance.
Thank you so much. So many more issues we could unpack more, but I want to be respectful of people's time, and I know we are at the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Patricia, Himre, Linus, Nick, of course, presenting the report, and Chris for participating in this discussion, and of course to Code for Africa for helping us cover some of these countries. You find a full report online on our website. We're also doing a podcast series where you can hear from some of the experts who wrote the different channels, go a bit more deep in depth on some of these issues. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I wish you all a very good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.